Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the international community at the Society of Professional Journalists. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Scott Griffen, who's the deputy director of the International Press Institute. Scott's been quoted around the world on various press freedom issues. And we've asked him here today to talk about the situation in South Korea with the new fake news law piece of legislation. So Scott, could you just tell us a little bit about the way you see the law as it's being written, what's happening, and what you think should be done about it?
Sure. Thanks, Dan, for having me. Glad to be here to talk about this issue. I mean, I would say first, just from a starting point, the term fake news is something that we find problematic. You know, it's a term that has been used, or phrase that has been used to attack journalists, to delegitimize independent journalism around the world. We all know, of course, something that Trump used, but it's spread around the world. And it's a term that we ourselves always put in quotes because I think it has the potential to damage press freedom and damage the work that journalists do. And we've seen, over the past few years that governments have increasingly picked up on this notion of fake news to pass legislation that really harms press freedom and potentially also creates an atmosphere in which self-censorship on the part of the media becomes more common. And up till now, we've mostly seen these types of laws and so-called fake news laws being passed in countries that we consider to be authoritarian or at least illiberal. And South Korea recently put forward a draft law, a bill that it's been called a fake news law. I don't think that they're going to use this term in the legislation itself, but it would allow people who believe that they have been harmed by media reports that they consider to be false, that have caused, a plaintiff some kind of damage, emotional damage, allows people to sue media and potentially recoup punitive damages up to 5 times the actual harm caused, whatever that may be. And this is a really, potentially huge amount. And IPI, from the beginning, we strongly criticized this law for a couple of reasons. First, on its merits, what is fake news, what is false information, and who is deciding what that is? And this is really at the core of the issue. Who is to say what's true and false? And we know that in journalism, critical journalism, investigative journalism is always contested. The people who are the targets of it will be the first ones to say that the journalism was false. And our concern is that this law opens the door for people who are the receiving end of critical news coverage to go to the courts and demand really potentially exorbitant claims of compensation. And it's not even necessarily that, South Korea is a democracy. It has a functioning rule of law. It has a functioning court system. And so it may well be the case that courts will throw out claims which have no merit. Someone comes to court and say, this newspaper wrote something about me, I say it's false, and I want $1 million from them. Courts may well throw these cases out. They may not, but in either case, there is some kind of threat there or intimidation to the media outlet. And our big fear is that it will potentially create this atmosphere of self-censorship, that media outlets say, this is a big, potentially big economic threat to us. If someone sues us for huge amounts of money, we need to set aside a sum of money. We need to pay legal costs, even if we're confident that we're going to win in the end. It's a huge burden. And unfortunately, you can easily imagine an editor saying, look, we're just going to put this story to the side rather than deal with potential, huge consequences, especially for smaller media that don't have access to the types of legal resources that larger media have. So this is really a huge problem with the bill. And in addition to everything, again, as I was saying before, what is fake news, what is false information. Someone has to decide. And again, even this this idea that someone could sue for up to 5 times the amount of actual damage caused. On the other hand, I think what's also concerning about this bill is this sort of domino effect on other countries, possibly. As I said before, we've seen a lot of these types of fake news laws pop up, particularly during the COVID crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But again, mostly in authoritarian countries. So Russia, for example, was leading the way, or in Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Cambodia. But South Korea is a democracy. And I think it would be a very very poor signal for a democratic state to sort of take this step to implement the kind of fake news law and say that it's compatible with press freedom, which it isn't. And I think it would give cover to states that have much more nefarious aims, basically. And I think it would encourage other countries to follow suit. And that's why I think for IPI, why we came out so strongly against this law was for those 2 reasons. First of all, the impact that it could have on South Korean media, and then the impact that it could potentially have globally. And I think those 2 things need to be seen together. And that's why we criticize the law. We call for it to be withdrawn, basically, by the governing party. And I must say there was a lot of criticism within South Korea, very strong reaction from, basically a common reaction from all journalism and media associations coming out against this law, strong reaction from the political opposition. And that actually did have an impact, together with the international criticism that the law was put on hold. And the ruling party announced a sort of month-long sort of rode back a little bit, announced a month-long consultative process, including participation from the political opposition, which we believe was a positive step in principle, also considering the fact that this law was something that was being rushed through Parliament, something with potentially big impact should not be going through the lawmaking process that quickly. So that in itself was good. Put on the brakes. Let's get back to the discussion. If the ruling party feels that the law in question is the Press Arbitration Act needs to be updated, let's have a discussion about it, and let's ensure that the views of those who will be most affected, which is the media industry, are brought in. Basically, we feel that anytime legislation is being introduced that affects the media, it's something that needs to be done in consultation with journalism groups, with media groups. And that's what we hoped would happen over the past month. It's difficult to say exactly to what extent that has gone on. I know that the 2 main parties are still squabbling about this bill. I must say that a 1-month consultation process is also very short. I'm not sure that enough really thought can be put into this bill, which is why we're still calling for it to be removed. As far as I know, there was supposed to be a vote this week. It's been continually postponed, and the opposition is threatening to launch, all kinds of constitutional challenges to the bill if it is passed, which is good. It should be challenged, but I haven't seen evidence that the ruling party is really stepping back from the core of this bill, which is additional penalties for media that publish so-called fake news, which is why we're still very much against it.
Yeah. Now, South Korea already has a defamation law, and in the research I've done on this, and the Korean journalists that I talked to about this, nobody's sure if this new law replaces the old one or if it's in addition. So a news organization could be hit twice under 2 separate pieces of legislation. Do you have any insight into that situation?
I don't have further insight into whether the 2 laws would be, would coexist in the sense that a plaintiff could bring separate challenges under both laws. I think that the point there is that South Korea does have a defamation law, and we all agree that, reputation, one's reputation is good that can be protected in court. IPI's position is that, defamation laws are legitimate as long as they are civil defamation laws, so they're not criminal cases, and as long as there are safeguards in place to prevent them from being abused. And South Korea, by the way, does have some issues there, including criminal defamation laws still on the books. So,
Right.
but these laws, I mean, defamation law in principle is enough in our view to support if someone really is harmed by media coverage, which of course does happen. There is bad journalism, that they can go to court to protect their right to reputation. So that's why also we don't really see a need for additional legislation. I'm not sure what what else this law brings to the table, except again, opening the door to intimidating and harassing media. So we already have enough legislative tools to deal with this issue. We don't need more, and certainly we don't need a duplication of defamation law.
Okay. You raised the same point that I did in discussing this with some of the South Korean journalists here in Washington. Was South Korea is a democracy, and were they to pass this fake news legislation, they would be the first democracy to pass such a law, and it would be a bad signal. And you did, talk about some of the implications. I'm just wondering if you could go into a little more depth about the danger enacting something like this in a liberal democracy could have on other liberal democracies, and also on places that may be tending away from democracy at this point.
Yeah. Well, I think, like I was saying at the beginning, I think this idea of fake news, this concept is a bit, it's caught on a bit like a wildfire, and it's spread around the world, and given an excuse to government leaders who are looking for a way to sell new restrictions on media, new restrictions on journalism, to give these restrictions the name of fake news, because nobody likes fake news, right? So whatever that is. So it's a way of selling these types of laws, particularly when they're done by these authoritarian regimes. It was done very well during COVID. Nobody wants false information about the pandemic, so let's pass some fake news laws and let's put a stop to all of that. So it's quite clever, but again, it's a concept that has caught fire, and it's very troubling to see a democratic country get caught up in this trend, because, as I was saying before, it legitimizes it. One thing is to say the Russian Federation is passing a fake news law where we already have a terrible situation for the media. It's another thing to say the Thai government, which is backed by the military, is passing a fake news law. We expect that these governments are looking for ways to restrict independent news coverage. It's a very different thing, in my view, if a democratic government is picking up on these terms. They give them credibility. I think it gives these types of concepts more momentum to spread, and I think it gives it cover. So we expected a domino effect again among these authoritarian states. What we want to stop is a domino effect among liberal democracies, among countries which should be models for press freedom, because it becomes very difficult for us, for example, as an international press freedom organization, to argue against authoritarian states that are passing fake news laws when we have democratic states like South Korea doing it as well. Of course, you argue with them while South Korea has a functioning system of the rule of law, but these are quite fine differences which aren't easy to point out. So I think that really what it does, again, is it gives momentum and cover, and it would be very problematic, and it's I think, again, one reason why we want to see this law really withdrawn is to stop any sort of domino effect taking place in this area of so-called fake news.
Okay, and so looking at the IPI, Human Rights Watch has criticized this legislation. Other journalism organizations have as well. Society of Professional Journalists has spoken out. What can we do outside South Korea about this kind of legislation?
Mm. Well, I think what we need to do is to raise awareness of the issue and put pressure. South Korea is a country that is sensitive to international opinion. They do care about their reputation when it comes to press freedom and fundamental rights. And IPI, I mean, that is our main goal, is to ensure that there is global attention on this issue. And I've seen increasing media coverage of this problem, which is also due to the great work done by South Korean media associations, South Korean journalism associations, to really raise the alarm bell. And I think that, yeah, also to make sure, to make sure the South Korean government also is aware of the international implications of what it's doing, not only the impact on South Korean media. So it's really about raising awareness. It's really about pointing out the international standards in this area, pointing out the damage, the long-term damage that could be done to the media in South Korea. Again, we need to move away from talking about, yes, of course, there are cases where, people are damaged by media reports, but there's existing legislation to fix this. We need to look at the big picture and understand what damage can be done to democracy, basically, in the case of South Korea. So that's the main thing, really. And I think this pressure, we've seen it, this pressure is working. That's why we had this delay in the bill. And it's still working because we're having now delays in the vote. And I think that any international support for defending press freedom in South Korea also gives, it boosts those organizations and associations in the country which are working to protect fundamental rights.
Well, thank you, Scott, very much for being here today with us and helping explain this issue in terms I think every journalist in the world can understand. This is not an esoteric issue, even though it does get bogged down in legislation and laws. Thank you again. I hope we'll be able to call on you again for some of your expertise.
Thanks a lot. Great to have this conversation.